Hi, my name is Austin Merrill, and I've chosen to do my presentation on Bernie Madoff and Ponzi fraud. We'll go over the basically what the Ponzi scheme is and how it came about. We'll talk about what Bernie Madoff did to target his people, and we'll talk about the regulators, how they missed some keys, and then we'll talk about what we can do to avoid these types of fraud. First of all, the Ponzi scheme itself is named after a guy named Charles Ponzi. He was an immigrant back in the 20s or around then. Basically convinced a lot of people that he had a way, he had exposed a loophole based on exchange rates of a European currency versus the US currency, that he could make a lot of money because the dollar was stronger. And through a form of stamps, he convinced them he could make them 50% return on their investment in just 45 days. And people lined up for miles to go invest with him. And in a short time, he had over $20 million. And all he had done was he was paying the oldest investors with the newest investors' money. Well, similar to that's how the Ponzi scheme became known. And similar to that, Bernie Madoff had adapted to a more modern time, and rather than look for people who are looking to get rich quick, he was looking for people who wanted to get rich over a long period of time. But in particular, he always focused on people who already were rich, had a lot of money to invest. So his targets became personal friends and acquaintances, and eventually led to charities and hedge funds. They had these feeder funds that would pay him to manage the money. His Ponzi was a little different. He would say, I can get you 1% return per month, and I have a proprietary way of doing it. And so his concept became marketed, not so much him, the individual. And that really made people, they believed it because it was somewhat plausible. And they had time to see, and money certainly. Well, because he wasn't the individual on the marketing materials, and he wasn't the one licensed, or he wasn't brought up in a lot of this, one man who started investigating this started to find some flaws. So he reverse engineered the methods that Bernie used to invest to see if he could duplicate this 1% per month, and within about 4 hours convinced himself it was fraud. He turned over that information to the SEC, and these investigators, they really dragged their feet and didn't do a lot. They knew of Bernie, and he was a former chairman of some sort to the NASDAQ. He was an old-time investor. He was kind of the one people went to, this wise investor. They didn't believe that he could be capable of this or whatever. They eventually did investigate a little bit about front running, but cleared him of it. Didn't believe he did any front running. The reason he became subject to such a scrutiny from skeptics was he had spiraled so far out of control. When he needed to get new money, he started going to these charities and hedge funds. And when he was going to these larger groups, he was able to give them, what could amount to double their fees that they would if they invested with someone else. And so they didn't vet him very well. They didn't check him. They just were more excited about getting the money. And the money came in by the billions and spiraled so far out of control. And then when the market crashed in 07 or in 08 to about a 70-year low, and people wanted their money, there was no money to be had. And Bernie admitted finally to his sons that he had been committing a fraud this whole time. And we wonder who would the blame go in such a big scheme, and really there was a lot of blame to go around. It was not just Bernie. Obviously he was the biggest part, but the regulators, the fund managers, the charities, the investors themselves. There were a lot of people who didn't check Bernie's credentials, and had anybody really started down that path at one point or another, could have really stopped this thing from spiraling so far out of control. And it makes you wonder, who can you trust? Well, you need to trust the same agencies, but you need to do a little bit of work yourself. We need to find out. Everybody touches our dollar. They have a name, a license, authorization to do it. And every now and then pay someone to independently evaluate it and make sure it's doing what is being claimed to be done. It may not stop fraud, because as we all know, fraud is usually found when the money's gone. but it will help us prevent and recognize some keys that were missed here in the Bernie Madoff scheme. And we can perhaps protect some of those we know and ourselves as well.